Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this member forum, which is intended to provide you with the information about guideline development process and a high-level overview of some of the changes you will see when you go into public comment on the draft revision to the Guideline for Medication Safety. My name is Erin Kyle, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the AORN Guidelines for Perioperative Practice. I'll be walking you through some of the basics of guideline development before I hand over to Dr. Julie Kahn, the lead author of the Guideline for Medication Safety, who will talk about some of the changes to the draft that you'll see in public comment. First, I want to tell you about who is involved in the guideline development process, which takes about 10 months to complete. First, there are AORN staff. So together with me, we have guideline authors who hold advanced degrees in nursing and have extensive experience in the operating room. We have a clinical research librarian who is also an RN with clinical background in the OR and a master's of library science. And our director of evidence-based practice, Lisa Spruce, who oversees all of it. We're so blessed to have such a talented and well-educated team. Next, we have the Guidelines Advisory Board, including a chairperson or co-chairs, and we have at least eight members who are perioperative nurse members of AORN, and also liaisons from other professional associations. Members are appointed in an effort for balanced representation in a variety of practice settings, and liaisons are appointed by organizations that they represent. The liaisons currently represent the following organizations: American Association of Nurse Anesthetists, American College of Surgeons, the Association for Professionals in Infection Control and Epidemiology, American Society of Anesthesiologists, International Association of Healthcare Central Service Material Management, was ISHM, now is HSPA, Healthcare Sterile Processing Association, the Society for Healthcare Epidemiology of America, and the Surgical Infection Society. Our team also includes evidence appraisers who are doctorally prepared nurses that are educated and able to use our evidence appraisal tools, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Evidence appraisers work with lead authors to evaluate the evidence used in updating and developing guidelines. Finally, we include subject matter experts in a variety of ways to develop and review specific content. Would you be surprised if I told you there are guidelines for guideline development? We use the 2011 National Academies of Medicine's Clinical Practice Guidelines We Can Trust standards for guideline development. The elements covered in these standards include establishing transparency, managing conflict of interest, convening an interdisciplinary group, conducting systematic reviews, establishing evidence foundations for rating strength of recommendations, articulation of recommendations, external review, and schedule for updating. We also submit our guidelines to the ECRI Guidelines Trust. The ECRI Guidelines Trust is a publicly available online repository of objective evidence-based clinical practice guidelines with the purpose of providing clinicians and members of the healthcare community with up-to-date clinical practices to advance safe and effective patient care. The ECRI Guidelines Trust is a centralized repository and includes evidence-based guidance developed by nationally and internationally recognized medical organizations and medical specialty societies like AORN. We submit each guideline after it is updated to the ECRI Guidelines Trust, and ECRI evaluates the guideline using predetermined criteria and scoring based on what is called a trust scorecard, which you see on the right side of your screen. After the guideline is evaluated, the trust scorecard and guideline brief is made available in the ECRI Guidelines Trust database. This is how we submit our guidelines to ensure that we are scoring high and we have good quality in the guidelines that we produce. Now I'll walk you through each of the steps of guideline development. First is the literature search. The search typically returns in the hundreds to sometimes thousands of resources, which are then screened for relevance. We will usually land on a few hundred references that eventually land in the guideline. After the literature search, each piece of evidence is appraised for strength and quality of evidence using AORN's appraisal tools, which I will show you in a moment. Appraisals are conducted by at least 2 independent appraisers. One is the lead author, and the other is one of the doctorally prepared nurses with clinical experience in the OR that I told you about previously. An appraisal score is assigned, and very low levels of evidence are not accepted. We have 3 appraisal tools that are specific to types of evidence, including non-research appraisal tools, research evidence appraisal tool for studies, and research evidence appraisal tool for summaries. The literature that we may use in the guidelines is designated non-research. It's scored either level 4 or level 5 and includes clinical practice guidelines, position statements, literature reviews, case reports, expert opinions, and organizational experience reports. The quality of these systematically evaluated using the quality of evidence criteria specific to each study type and are scored A for high quality, B for good quality, and C for low quality. The research study appraisal tool is used for randomized controlled trials, quasi-experimental studies, meaning those that include an intervention but no randomization and or no control or comparison group, studies that are non-experimental, descriptive, or observational. These are our 1s, 2s, and 3s and are evaluated for quality and assigned scores of A, B, and C in the same way as non-research studies. Finally, there are the research summaries. This tool is used to appraise systematic reviews and meta-analyses and are either 1s or 2s, depending on the types of studies that were included in the systematic review. These are also rated for quality A, B, or C. This is a graphic depiction of the AORN evidence hierarchy. As you can see, it is divided into research and non-research and lists evidence types that fit into which level of evidence from 1 to 5. So we've discussed now the literature search and evidence appraisals. Now let's talk about the AORN evidence rating model, which determines which evidence types and quality translate into levels of evidence. High quality evidence includes 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B. High evidence supports recommendations with a wide range of studies with no major limitations and little variation between studies. Moderate quality evidence includes 3A or 3B. These may also support recommendations or conditional recommendations where maybe there are not many studies or have some limitations but no major flaws. We may also see variation in study results. Low quality evidence includes C's and all non-experimental studies. These studies may have major flaws, there may be no rigorous studies, or there may be important variation between studies. So after we have all of our evidence systematically gathered and appraised, we are ready to write recommendations. Drafting recommendations is an iterative process and involves dialogue between the lead author, editor, other members of the nursing practice team at AORN, subject matter experts, and the Guidelines Advisory Board. This process takes months and is very tedious. And then step 4 is where we ensure that all of the elements that are required in the guideline are included there before preparing the draft for public comment. I want to talk a little bit more about how recommendation is actually constructed using the evidence. When crafting recommendation statements, we consider the evidence rating, benefit harm assessment, and resource use. When constructing recommendation statements, these may be designated as regulatory requirement, recommendation, conditional recommendation, or no recommendation can be made. So regulatory requirements are just that, things that healthcare workers and organizations are bound to under the law and are required by regulatory bodies like the FDA. Recommendations are made when benefits clearly exceed harms. They are supported by high to moderate quality evidence and may be based on low quality evidence when higher quality evidence doesn't exist, but the recommendation is supported by a guideline, a position statement, or consensus statement or standard. A conditional recommendation is made when benefits are likely to exceed harms and may be supported by any level of evidence. No recommendation is used when there is both a lack of evidence and an unclear balance between benefits and harms. It's important to note that no recommendation does not mean that we don't recommend the action. It means that we can't recommend one way or the other because of the lack of evidence. In developing recommendation statements, we use standardized terminology. Should indicates that a certain course of action is recommended. Must is used only to describe requirements mandated by the government regulation. The use of may indicates that a course of action is permissible within the limits of the recommendation, and can indicates possibility and capability. You will notice that each recommendation uses action verbs, and in this change that we made to our style in the last few years is an attempt to make the guidelines easier to understand and implement. So this graphic found on our evidence model, and all of these images are available on our website in the guidelines section. You feel free to review those anytime. So this graphic pulls all of this information together. Perioperative teams must implement regulatory requirements, should implement recommendations everywhere and in every situation, and may implement conditional recommendations depending on the practice setting and the unique benefit harm assessment in that specific setting. When there is no recommendation, perioperative team members will need to evaluate whether or not to implement this practice issue using the little available evidence and information that they have in their own site. So just to review, regulatory requirements must implement the recommendation. The recommendation, these are the should statements. Perioperative team members should implement unless a clear and compelling rationale for an alternative support is present. Conditional recommendations, perioperative team members may implement the recommendation. And no recommendation means perioperative team members will need to evaluate whether or not to implement the practice issue. And again, this does not mean that we recommend against things in the guidelines. So no recommendation is not a negative. It means that there's a lack of evidence. So within guidelines, one of the guiding principles that we use is that the guidelines should be the gold standard. This is what practice should be. And it's not a reflection of what is or what we have always done. So where are we now? We are here with medication safety, public comment up for a period of 30 days, and we're already into it a few days. So the intent of this member forum is to invite you to contribute to the development of the guideline by submitting your comments. Your comments can help us make the guideline language as clear as possible. So some key elements of a persuasive public comment. You want to suggest alternative text if you find something confusing or unclear. Provide a rationale for the change. For example, you have access to research that supports different language. And also cite the evidence to support the change. If you do have evidence, please provide us with that citation so we can ensure that it's included if we didn't find it in our systematic review. And be sure, again, that you're not submitting comments to reflect the way we do it here, or we have always done it this way. So after the guideline has been developed, the draft is uploaded for public comment, which is where we are now. And all of the public comments are completed and compiled. We have a spreadsheet that we use to track these. The draft is then reviewed by the lead author and me. So the two of us get together and we go through every single comment that was submitted. We talk them through and we either accept them, which means that someone has suggested language that we think is more clear than what we landed on in the beginning. Sometimes we'll accept with modifications. Sometimes we do get recommendations for changes in language that make it clear to us that the language that we have used is not clear enough, but the interpretation and the suggested change was also not clear. So we need to further clarify that. That's what accept with modification generally is used for. Not accept is we will sometimes choose this option if the comment is not supported by evidence or doesn't provide alternative text or we don't understand it. Sometimes we get incomplete recommendations And those are the ones that we don't accept. Finally, the draft then is amended in collaboration with the editor-in-chief and then is sent to the Guidelines Advisory Board for final approval. So that is step 7. Then after the guideline has been approved by the Guidelines Advisory Board, it is released on eGuidelines Plus. So it's released electronically very soon after it's approved, usually within a matter of a couple of months. And then it is included in the next print year version, which is available in January. We will be taking questions at the end of today's presentation. So at this time, I'll hand the presentation over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Julie Kahn, who will talk about some of the changes that you will see when you go to comment on the draft revision of the Guideline for Medication Safety. Julie?
Hey, good afternoon. Here, let me get that going. Nope. All right. Can you see my screen here? Looks good. All right. So good afternoon. Thank you, AORN, for your great introduction and wonderful information about guideline development process. It is quite the process, and it's good for people to know what it is. So I'm Julie. I'm a senior perioperative practice specialist at AORN. I was, like AORN said, the lead author on this guideline revision. And I'll be reviewing the selected updates from the draft of this, the Guideline for Medication Safety. Now, there are a surprisingly large number of changes made to this document, and we only have time to go through some highlights. So make sure you log in and go to the public comment process to review it in depth and add your comments there. It is critically important that you remember that these are just proposed changes and that as AORN pointed out, the draft will go through several additional rounds of editing and review of those public comments. So it is just a draft at this point. So we're here to discuss these changes. On your screen here is the public, I put a QR code. You can bookmark that page. It'll take you right to the public commenting page. It is open now through October 22nd. Alternatively, you could go to the AORN.org homepage and you can scroll down to the area that you see on the screen here that says public commenting open now and log in, and you can go in that way. You will probably need to either log in as a member or create a free account to put comments in the system. So please make sure you bookmark. So there are 5 new sections in the guideline, and I just wanted to kind of give you a little overview of what currently is and what is that you'll see in the draft. So the first section was changed to organizational oversight. And the content in there was extensively updated and now includes policies and procedures that were specific to organizational wide policies. So a lot of you, as you're well aware, there's organizational wide medication management policies, and then sometimes there's department specific policies. So if it really is specific to the whole organization, like use tall man lettering, then all of that is up in organizational oversight. There are some policy and procedure statements throughout, like in hazardous medications and various other places that are really specific to maybe perioperative services. Additionally, we did create a section, the section that was named Transitions of Care is now named Medication Reconciliation to kind of make alignment there. A lot of the content in there is either on medication histories or medication reconciliation processes. And then there currently is information in the guideline about communication and labeling, but it was kind of hidden in other sections. So I did pull those sections out, create new sections, and added new content to both the team communication and labeling sections, which are new in this edition. And a new section was dedicated to high alert medications. And there was some, again, similarly, there is content in the guideline now on high alert medications, but we did expand that and we moved it all into its own section so it's easier for you to find. And lastly, we added a section on technology because, as we all know, that's everywhere. So we're diving in now. On the screen are the primary proposed labeling recommendations. I put this first because generally labeling is one of the big things that we do, and it is a source of errors. So note that the words placement on the sterile field were removed here from the current edition. And this is because anytime you take a medication or solution and you remove it from the original container, it should be labeled. It doesn't matter if it's on the sterile field or not. So for instance, if you're preparing a medication to be used when the patient's like just prior to patient prepping, and you're going to draw that up and have it in a syringe, and you're going to put it with the other supplies for prepping, then you're going to want to label it, right? So we did update this recommendation in that way. Secondly, note that we did remove the recommendations about labeling medications with the date and time that they were accepted onto the sterile field. Now, this was because most things in the perioperative setting revolve around expiration dates, not the dates and times you put it on the sterile field. Almost everything else is based on expiration date processes. So in order to create consistency in perioperative practice and prevent confusion or errors, we removed that language from that recommendation, and we created an activity statement under this recommendation 9.1.1, which you now see at the bottom of your screen, to clarify labeling related to expiration dates on medication. So if you think something is going to expire during if there's a high chance it's going to expire during your procedure, you're definitely going to want to label it with either the beyond use date or the expiration date. And I'm not going to go into beyond use date here, but we have a definition and we have additional language on determining beyond use dating in the guidelines. So make sure you take a look at that. All right, moving on to compounding. All right, compounding has gotten more complicated. So just bear with me as we walk through this process. Compounded medications are not approved by the FDA, and they are associated with rates of contamination and inconsistent amounts of ingredients. Therefore, the FDA has been working to improve the safety and efficacy of these compounded medications. And because of that work, the FDA has published updated information about compounding practices. So I came up with this primary and secondary way of looking at it. That's not an FDA thing. So bear with me. That's still a developing concept in my mind. It's not in the guideline, but it's kind of how to think about it when you read the content. So there's primary and secondary strategies for how you would get or procure compounded medication. So let's take heparinized saline, okay? It would be best to purchase this direct from the manufacturer if you can find it. Now, if you can't get it from a manufacturer, then the next best thing would be to get it from a source that would be an FDA registered outsourced facility. And you ask yourself, oh my goodness, what is that, right? So there on the screen, you see that QR code. It will take you to an FDA site that has information about facilities that are registered. Outsourcing facilities are a category of compounding pharmacies that have registered with the FDA. And these facilities have higher quality standards than regular compounding pharmacies and that are not registered. Registered outsourcing facilities may perform medication compounding, and they are inspected by the FDA on a risk-based schedule. Obtaining compounded medication from outsourcing facilities increases the likelihood that regulatory requirements and good manufacturing practices are met. Now, if you can't find your hep saline from an outsourcing facility, then the next best bet is to use a compounding pharmacy that meets the USP 797. So USP is the US Pharmacopoeia, 797 is the compounding chapter. These facilities are compounding pharmacies are not like your typical commercial pharmacies where you go to pick up a prescription. These are pharmacies that specialize in producing compounded medications. And when primary strategies for compounded medication procurement are not available to you, your next step would be to have your facility make that hep saline for you. So now we're below that little yellow line here. If your facility is making your hep saline for you in the pharmacy, they have usually access to hoods that are used in the compounding process to reduce the risk of contamination during mixing. Additionally, pharmacists and pharmacy technicians may have more experience with determining the amounts of each solution that are needed in compounding medications, and this may reduce the risk of medication errors during the preparation phase. Lastly, if none of these other options is available to you, you can still compound medications in the OR, but it should in fact be your last resort, kind of like that hierarchy of controls from NIOSH. It's kind of similar in that way. So see section 6.8. Our recommendations on that are very similar to what have been in there in the current recommendations. So please see these changes in the draft. They are, as you note on the screen, it says 3.2, 3.21, and then 6.8. They are in different sections because some of it's about procurement and then some of it's about preparation. So just make sure you don't miss any of that. In the current guideline, we recommend initiating administration of spiked IV bags within 1 hour of puncture. And on the screen here, you will see the proposed change. We're proposing that the decision about the amount of time between IV bag puncture and the beginning of administration be made by your facility. This is because there's no identified evidence supporting this recommendation in the literature. Again, USP 797, which mentions use of compounded medications within 1 hour of preparation, that guidance is limited to only immediate use compounded sterile preparations. So it's not, if you have an IV bag and you haven't added anything to it, it is not a compounded medication, and therefore that 1 hour rule would not apply. So additionally, there was one study that was done by some anesthesiologists. They studied IV bags, and even after 8 hours after being punctured, there was no contamination rates. They studied several different hour periods, and 8 was the most, and none of their IV bags had any contamination. And that's in the rationale for this section, so you can see that too. So please go into the public comment and add your comments on this one. We did add a proposed recommendation this year on organizational oversight of perioperative practice that involve routine use of antimicrobials. I do want to stress routine use. We'll talk about that in a second. So interoperative use of antibiotics is very common, as you know. The literature showed that there's a high rate of reported errors, but there's limited standardization, there's limited adherence to accepted clinical practice guidelines, and there's limited oversight by facility antimicrobial stewardship committees. Now, hospitals are required to have antimicrobial stewardship programs for optimization of antibiotic use throughout the organization, but sometimes perioperative services might get a little lost in that. So oversight and review of perioperative practices that involve the routine use of antibiotics may increase the judicious and evidence-based use of these medications. And we certainly want to promote that because we don't want resistance. Now, I do want to clarify that routine use is very different than therapeutic use. Therapeutic use is really when a patient has an infection and they're being treated, compared to just routine use of antibiotics. Now, we're not saying, don't give the patient preoperative antibiotics. Certainly, that's a standard, and we just want the antimicrobial stewardship committee at your facility to take a look at these processes in depth and make sure that they're in line with other clinical practice guidelines that guide those practice use. And you'll see here a laundry list of things in that recommendation that could be, that the Antimicrobial Stewardship Committee should be looking at if it pertains to your facility. So please, this was new. It was really eyeballed heavily by the Guidelines Advisory Board that Erin talked about earlier. So please, we ask for your comments on this section. It is 1.7. All right, so new is the technology, section 16. So technology and many medication management processes are almost synonymous. And we added this new section in this edition. please make sure you go in and public comment on this. As a brief overview, we recommend standardization throughout the facility when possible, pre-purchase evaluation of these devices, and there's a whole guideline on that, so make sure if you have questions, that's where to direct it. Configuration of searchable fields for these devices should have at least 5 letters of the medication name. So having less than 5 has been shown to maybe contribute to some errors. So 5 letters in the name when possible. Not all devices may support that technology, but if it does, it should, if you can. We recommend use of automatic dispensing cabinets, ADCs, when possible. And survey by the ASHP showed that most facilities do actually use those. And then use of machine readable coding devices. Those include things like barcoding or radio frequency identification, again, when possible, and use of smart infusion pump technology with engaged dose error systems. I know that's a mouthful. To be used for continuous, intermittent, or secondary medication infusions. And also those smart infusion pumps for patient-controlled analgesia, all when possible. We always, as always, we recommend you follow the manufacturer's instructions for use, your facility policies and procedures, and provide education and competency verification on use of these devices, as well as review the quality metrics associated with these devices. And the literature was pretty clear that direct observation for quality for these device use is really important in identifying quality issues that are occurring in clinical practice that might not be reported or might not be captured by the device. Hazardous medication section contains significantly reorganized and expanded content. And so anti-neoplastic agents is the language that we use. These are commonly called chemotherapy medications, right? These types of medications are the most commonly discussed medication in the evidence for this section. However, NIOSH publishes a list of hazardous medications, and each facility is supposed to have a list of hazardous medications that they use on site that's updated when there's changes. So please take a look at the NIOSH list and your own list. One surprising thing I took away from the literature was that many people don't wear one or more types of PPE when handling hazardous medications. That included pregnant personnel. So evidence showed that facilities with robust leadership support for personnel, access to PPE, and education for PPE about the importance of PPE are a lot more, the personnel there are a lot more likely to use PPE when handling hazardous medications. So that was an important takeaway, and you'll see that in this section when you review it. This section also contains 2 new tables. There was not any tables in the guideline before. So 2 new tables, and the first table is about risk of exposure and recommended PPE based on the types of activities that are being performed, such as instrument decontamination or room cleaning, or taking care of excrement from a patient. One of the proposed changes in regard to the use of a respiratory protection device was regarding this respiratory protection device or surgical mask when handling hazardous medications. So the current guideline recommends use of an N95 or more protective respirator when handling these hazardous medications. Now, if there's an anticipated risk of hazardous medication aerosolization, then use of respiratory protection is necessary and still recommended. You see here on the screen, that's 12.7.2. That is very much kind of in line with what we have now, although we did add some language about surgical N95s for splash splatter and sprays. However, aerosolization of hazardous medications during procedures that use large volumes of anti-neoplastic agents, it was not found. There was not aerosolization reported in several studies that looked at this. Therefore, we changed the recommendation. So the proposed recommendation 12.7.4 that you see there on the screen discusses selection and use of respiratory protection devices or surgical masks based on various factors, such as your medication management plan at your facility, your scheduled procedure, the medication administration method that's being used, and risk for exposure. So to give you a little example, if you're putting mitomycin in somebody's eye, that might be very different than using than performing a HIPEC procedure. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So performing a risk-based assessment to determine whether you need a surgical mask or a surgical N95 is really important. However, it's important also to keep in mind that N95 respirators do not protect from volatile organic compounds, gases, or vapors. So evidence and guidance from other professional organizations recommend the use of full face piece chemical cartridge type respirators or PAPRs, that's powered air purifying respirators, when cleaning large spills and when gases or vapors from hazardous medications is suspected. So the guideline contains this statement on examples of large spills. So a large spill might be an IV bag breaking, leakage from disconnected IV tubing, or spills that cannot be contained within a spill kit would fall under that umbrella of a large spill. So the use of protective equipment for vapors and gas is a little more narrow. So you'll see that in the guideline in this section as well. Now, HIPEC stands for hypothermic intraperitoneal chemotherapy, and HITOC is hyperthermic intrathoracic chemotherapy, and PICPAC stands for pressurized intraperitoneal aerosol chemotherapy. So if you're unfamiliar with these procedures, they go in, they do a large debulking of cancer that is diffuse typically in either the peritoneal or thoracic cavity. And then in HIPEC or HITOC, they infuse a large volume of heated chemotherapy agent and they let it swirl around there for a really long time. It could be up to 2,000 milliliters of volume of chemotherapy. It's infused via pump, and then the pump takes it back out. Typically, there's different methods, but overall. Now, these procedures, they do use those large volumes compared to other types of procedures. And there were studies on anti-neoplastic agent environmental contamination for each of these procedures. So in how contaminated the environment was with chemotherapy agents when these procedures were performed. Now, the current guideline only contains a few recommendations related to preventing personnel exposures and environmental contamination from those chemotherapy agents during HIPEC procedures. So this addition of HITOC and PICPAC is new. There is a long list of recommendations starting at section 12.7 with the table 2 that you see here. Now this table 2 that's on the screen, it's only one very small part of a large table. That's all I could fit on your screen. So recommendations on this topic continue all the way down to section 12.17.8. And if your facility is currently performing or will be starting a program involving these procedures, I ask you to please review these recommendations. We would love your feedback on these proposed changes. There was a lot of proposed changes in this section. Now, as you know, many hazardous medications are known carcinogens, and there is no identified safe level of exposure for personnel right now. Additionally, environmental contamination from these medications could be invisible to personnel. So if it was on a surface that you were touching, you might not actually know it was there. The studies on HIPEC, HITOC, and PICPAC procedures did report a low risk of accidental exposure to anti-neoplastic medications when you take precautions, you use proper PPE, and you perform thorough deactivation and cleaning of the spaces and the devices and the instruments being used. However, all of the studies found some level of hazardous medication contamination on the floor or on the installation pump device used in these procedures. Additionally, all the studies in this section reported areas or items such as the floor or the installation device were contaminated with hazardous medications before the procedure even started. They all found some level. Now, some levels were low and some levels were higher, but there was contamination both before and after the procedures. And a lot of these researchers didn't quite know what to make of all of that. One study even reported environmental contamination of an anti-neoplastic agent on the floor and on the device being used to pump the chemotherapy in during a HIPEC procedure. They found contamination of a chemotherapy agent that wasn't even used during that procedure. So there's a lot more to learn here. We don't quite know all of the details about why we're finding these levels. So the takeaway here is that clearly environmental contamination is a concern when performing these procedures. We do still think there's a low risk if you take proper precautions. But in addition to those proper precautions and decontamination recommendations that we have in the guideline already, or in the revised guideline, we did add a series of recommendations on environmental surface sampling. Now, environmental, that's on the screen here, you see 1220 to 1220.8. Those, all of these have to do with environmental surface sampling. Environmental surface sampling is used to identify hazardous medications in the environment. When standardized processes are implemented by a facility, environmental surface sampling can provide information on the effectiveness of the processes for preventing exposure to hazardous medications, such as PPE use, deactivation, and cleaning methods. So how well we're doing, if used properly, these methods might be able to give us some insight on how clean our environment is. So this is a big change, and we really would invite your comments here on this section. So please make time for that if you can. And there's a lot more new and revised content that I just can't go into today. So we would love your feedback during this public commenting period. It is now until October 22nd. The comments do need to be entered through that official process on the website that we talked about earlier. And providing those, just as Erin said, providing those references from peer-reviewed published evidence for content changes is really, really helpful and important. And one last thing, when discussing medication safety these days, often the topic of criminalization comes up. So I didn't want to neglect it. But I did want to say that while the guideline does contain like a wealth of recommendations on reporting and quality measures that focus on those system-based improvements, it does not contain information related to criminalization. However, AORN has a position statement on criminalization of human errors in the perioperative setting. And the QR code here on the screen will take you to our website that has all of our position statements, of which you can see that one there. And you may need to log in as a member to get to that portion of the website. But I thought that might be an important add to mention here at the end. So in closing, I would just like to say thank you so much for your membership. It is because of members like you that we can continue to create these high quality guidelines and focus on advocacy for perioperative patients and those of you who care for them. And we want to thank you for attending and for all you do for our patients and our profession. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. That was a really wonderful overview, and I'm so glad that we recorded this so that others who have questions about some of the changes they might see in public comment can also access that. So everyone, if you have not had the chat open, you can open up the chat and see a link to where this recording will be made available. We haven't had a lot of questions come up in the chat box yet. We did have one question that we shouldn't be surprised about, and it was about drug shortages and some limited ability to get Marcaine and lidocaine with epinephrine added. Julie, I chatted that to you just with a little summary of of what the question was and how we responded. So we do invite you to keep us informed about any drug shortages that you have. So the beauty of the way that this guideline is written is that you can go into the compounding section, you can make decisions about how to respond to situations where you may need, where you find yourself having to do something to get the resources that you need. And even if you think that compounding in the OR is the only option that you have, you may have other options. And reaching out to a pharmacy, even if you're part of an ambulatory surgery center, may be an option for you that you could explore. And Julie, I'll give you a minute to catch up and look at look at that chat to see if there's anything that you want to add to that. So I'm going to keep looking for more questions.
Yeah, while I review this question, I just want to point out that we did add some content on shortages in the guideline. I did not cover it extensively. It does start in section 1.8. And a lot of those decisions are made at a very at a high level. Now, if you're in an ASC, that'll be sometimes maybe you, but we did add some content in there to help guide shortages, because the evidence wasn't real clear, but it doesn't seem that shortages are going away. ASHP does some surveys. That's the Hospital Pharmacy Association. They do some surveys on shortages, and they've found continual shortages for years and years. And so having a process in place to deal with shortages and how you and having a standard, so you know, okay, we're experiencing a shortage, here's the steps we're gonna implement to see if we can eliminate or mitigate it, is really, really great. So let me continue to review this specific question, and we might need to get back on that.
Yeah, well, we're happy to follow up for any questions that we don't get to today, because we are technically out of time, but we do want to be sure that we answer any questions that we're able to as we're here now. Julie, I see. IV hang time as a question. So it looks like, can you give guidance on IV piggyback start and back times? Is there a recommendation? I noticed that IV time in OR, how long it should hang. I just read that verbatim.
We don't. Yeah. The limitation, our guidance on puncturing or spiking is truly just limited to when you puncture it and how long before you can administer it. And really, we're changing that to say your facility should work together in a collaborative team within an infection preventionist to figure that out. We don't provide guidance on IV piggybacks length of time, but I would be there is a chance that your facility may have guidance on that in some of their policies and procedures, or in the order that was written for that medication. So there might be some guidance there. And it, as a last, never as a last resort, but as an additional step, you could always check with your pharmacist too. The Antimicrobial Stewardship Committee might have something to say in regards to that as well. I see a question here about best practices around dispensing devices for powders to the sterile field. So there's no evidence on powder delivery to the sterile field, because most of the time the medications that are being used there are usually intended to be used as a solution and not a powder. So if you read, say, vancomycin powder instructions for use, you would see reconstitution guidance and all that kind of stuff. So we don't have recommendations on dispensing of powders. In the guideline for sterile technique, there is some discussion about making sure that things you put on the sterile field are sterile. So there are some things that are not. So you like antiseptic agents are sometimes not always sterile. So you gotta take a look at those. I would recommend reading your manufacturer's instructions for use, and then reaching out to a pharmacist, or doing a small test of change to see what works best.
Okay, excellent. Julie, I think we're I think we're at the end of the questions that have been submitted. Just as a reminder, we do have a consult line that you can call and ask clinical questions, and you can find information about that number and the hours for the consult line on our website. Also, feel free to use OR Nurse Link to ask questions of your colleagues. You can also submit questions to members of the AORN nursing practice team there. We're happy to help you in any way that we can. And we appreciate your presence today. And we look forward to looking at any comments that we receive on the guideline after having this presentation. Again, just to reiterate what Julie said earlier, we appreciate your membership. We appreciate all that you do. And we're just so glad that we have such a wonderful membership base that we can support and that supports us in supporting you. So this concludes our presentation today, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.